everyone, welcome back to Alkaline Hydroxide 784, and today we shall start the second season of GPO, which is episode 26. And this month, I think the general theme will be subjects. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna cover different subjects as the topics for the month of December. And you might be wondering, wait a minute, this is GPO, not any other subject. Why are we covering other subjects in the GP series? Well, but there's still a logic for doing this because there are definitely questions that relate to certain fields of study. For example, basically, in general, what you'll see is how useful that particular subject is in our greater lives and things like that, like what's the importance of it, or like how it's useful in a sense. So today we'll be looking at how history is useful to us, and also what are the things that you need to take note of in terms of the concession. What are the concessions to be said while saying that history is useful? So you'll be following the same vein for all of these subject-based episodes, and we'll basically see what is their usefulness or otherwise. And yeah, as usual, here are the timings. And this season, I'll be trying the chapter feature in YouTube by putting the timestamps in the description. Hopefully, it works. Right, so before we start, let's just quickly go through what history is. So, history is basically the subject in which you look at the past. Of course, the typical history class tends to focus on political and other significant events, but do note it is possible to study the history of widely different things, from math history to history of comic books to history of your own school or university to the history of the study of history. That's probably a thing. So you get the point. In fact, history can be applied to literally anything. So let us explore the usefulness of history. First off, history allows us to understand ourselves and the world around us. I'll probably be covering it in three different areas: culture, society, and science. Okay, so think about it. To understand ourselves, we can't really definitely know the future. We can only know either the past or the present. And the present is a really tiny time slice in the whole measure of time. So, in a way, the present isn't much of an information source compared to the vastness that is the past. So, by looking at this vast past, we can learn about us, the other living beings, the environment, and even intangible things. So, first, let's look at culture. So, in terms of culture, if we look at our own traditions and things like that, we can learn more about our own ancestry and learn more about traditions that were lost to time. And we can probably maybe revive them or even revive languages that were lost to time or almost lost to time, because if they're completely lost, it's a bit hard to completely revive the language. But we know that there are a few languages that have a very few small number of speakers, but since it has a history, we can try to get that, revive those languages again. So through doing all of this and learning about our past, we feel more connected to it. We connect with each other as well. Maybe like, because if you think about it, the past, as we go further and further back in time, it will encompass more and more people. So by going back to the past and realizing that at one point of time all of the humans came from one single area, you feel more connected with the rest of humanity and you feel more positive about it. So the next point is, by studying the traditions, the other things that you can do is, it's because we know that people did all kinds of traditions and then eventually some of them fell out of practice, some of them still continue today, and some of them just randomly popped up and disappeared in like 2 days or something. And in order to figure out why, if we go into greater detail and find out more information about it, then we can find out why people suddenly take up certain traditions or why certain traditions get lost to time and why some still stay alive today. And from that we can actually understand how society how the people in the past worked, like how the human mind works and how people interacted with each other. So in a way the history helps us with knowing about the human mind as well, like psychology, or even about how humans interacted with each other or how they decided to do certain things. So yeah, apart from that, you can probably also learn about things like traditional medicines, traditional practices of other sorts as well, like the other things I can learn about. So if you want to go towards more, more culture kind of thing, like popular culture, you can look at fashion trends or popular media, and this would allow us to understand the evolution of those things until now. So this also may help us by studying the context around why these things happen. We get to understand what is their connection with other significant events. So for example, how the Cold War influenced popular media. If you do not know about this, well, in the Cold War, both the US and the USSR like their propaganda. And it is actually one of the reasons why the superhero films were somewhat started getting produced in that sort of storyline in that timing, because so like for example, if you know about some of the superheroes, I think the most obvious, like the way that the storyline works is usually that the superhero is fighting against someone who is supposedly the rival country, or you know what I mean. It's like propaganda but hidden in a Marvel film or something. So this actually, like, history can actually influence culture, so it's useful to study it and then find out, oh, this is why this happened. You get to learn more new things about it and view your movies in a new light. So I think the last point that I put here is about culture influencing language. So the fact that um you know the fact that English right now is spoken by so many people and not just the people of England already tells us a lot. So by finding the history of how this particular event happened, the fact that a lot of people can speak English now, or actually actively seek to speak English, it tells us a lot of useful information about how people in how people interact with each other in a more present kind of history, I guess. And it helps us to realize how interconnected we are, even before globalization. There's already some sort of a primitive form of globalization from the very beginning. And apart from a lot of people knowing English, there's also localized influences, like for example Shakespearean English, because Shakespeare introduced a lot of words to the English language. And of course, in the end, it becomes a more globalized thing because English itself became more globalized. But likewise, there are other cases in which you can, spot such changes, or certain regions having slightly different language and all that. So the history may help us to understand these things in greater detail. So the second aspect is in society. So in terms of society, we can first off look at how society reacted to various events in the past. So while studying history, we don't just look at the event itself, but we see how the society behaved during the event. So this allows us to understand how people would behave with regards to a certain event or something happening, and we can see the effects of certain variables or certain context on human society. And basically we'll look at this in greater detail in the second point, but that's the main idea of society. So history helps us to better understand how society works, and that is quite useful because we need to know how society works nowadays in order to, especially for policy making and things like that. So I'll talk about that in the second point. So apart from that, by second point, the second big point, yeah. So apart from that, in terms of society, we can also look at how humans fundamentally organize themselves and how things like politics, language, and more evolve. So you know that there's democracies and stuff like that today, but you don't really know where it originated from, right? So history will help us understand stuff like that as well, because that's actually quite important to know, because if you don't know where where the current system came from, then you cannot really just blame the current system without knowing how it came to be in the first place. So by understanding how the system formed and evolved over the years, you can then use that to your own, in terms of how you want to further evolve it in the future, or how what's the best way to go about changing the system. Because as we all know, when something is entrenched for a very long time, it's hard to change. So by understanding what exactly got entrenched better than others, we can then pick at it in a way that makes it easier to change certain systems. So yeah, history is actually important in that sense too. And the third aspect is in terms of science. So one of the scientific fields is astronomy, and that is actually kind of like space history in a way, because if you look at something in the sky, like all the stars, you're not looking at this current moment. The thing that you're looking at is something that came from at least a few minutes ago. In fact, even our sun, the amount of time that the light takes to travel to Earth is 8 minutes. So when you're looking at the sun, you're looking at it that from 8 minutes ago. So astronomy is literally looking into the past. And astronomy also deals with a lot of things that happened in the past, like the Big Bang, and also what forces created the solar system, what forces will what are the forces that are impacting the space right now. And yeah, in the same line, we can talk about the hype over time machines and also physics theories based on the future, like the progression of time, because we know that there's this whole thing about time being a fourth dimension. However, we are not able to travel along that fourth dimension, but merely see it happening as we go along. Like we cannot voluntarily move ourselves to and fro in terms of time, because there seems to be some issue with it. And honestly, it's better that way, because I hate the idea of time machines. I'm super scared about them. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Anyways, in okay, then apart from that, we can look at you know yeah, in the same vein again, we can look at the past events on Earth. For example, if we know what happened very, very, very long ago, for example, why the dinosaurs went extinct, the theory was that there was this 10-kilometer asteroid that went and hit the Earth, and that's why that happened. Then we are more aware of such dangers existing, and maybe more adequately prepare us, in sense, prepare ourselves for those threats and actually look out for such asteroids. And not just the super big ones, but the smaller asteroids as well. And yeah, likewise, as we look at the universe and look further, and you try to figure out what happened in the past, then maybe we might get a better understanding of what might happen to planet Earth under certain circumstances. So basically, I guess most of it is literally just astronomy. But apart from astronomy, another thing that history can help us find out is basically the medicine part of it, which basically traditional medicines, what went right, what went wrong, because it's not just about what went right, which of course if it went right, then you might as well recreate it and make it better. But if something went wrong, like for example, there was one incident where they didn't know that the medicine would actually cause a certain problem. So there was this medicine that was meant to cure morning sickness, but what happened is the that particular molecule is chiral, and it had another, like the stereoisomer causes some issues, and I think it caused some problems, birth defects or something, in the babies after they were born. So they didn't know it at the time, and after these things happen, it became more important to actually check and isolate the right stereoisomers when doing medicine. So by learning from history, we are able to both um, further the rights and get rid of the wrongs basically. And apart from medicine, we can also look at climate change. So if you think about it, the history of climate in the sense is not just about human influenced climate change, but you can also look at the ice age of really long ago, or even the times when it was really hot due to the volcanoes and stuff like that. So by by looking at those events, we can then understand what factors can cause either temperature increases or decreases, which will allow us to understand the weather patterns and what happens due to volcanoes or due to stuff like the La Nina or El Nino, those things. They can understand how those events will impact the Earth's temperatures or weather or climate or whatever it is through by knowing what happened in the past. Yeah, so likewise, there's many other places in which history can help. Maybe in construction, like because there are certain stuff like the pyramids. The pyramids are somewhat still standing today, so maybe that can help modern day constructors to figure out how to build nice structures, and also other areas as well. So you can come up with your own examples for this. So, in general, the idea is that understanding our past motivates us to do more ourselves. So, by doing more is like we we make sure to enact the stuff that was good and make it even better, and also make sure to eliminate anything that's not going well based on what we have gathered from the past. And it also gives us reassurance that humans have come thus far. So it gives us this inspiration to keep going and keep trying to innovate and do new things. Because we know that, like, if unless you understand how all of these innovations came today, you feel like, well, you already have so many things, why do we need to keep doing more things? Well, by knowing about how all of those things came to be, you are then inspired to do the same effort and try to create even better progress. As we know, the last few years have been, the years where there's been a huge change in what people are using. Like, smartphones aren't that old technically. I mean, yeah, like maybe to some people it's old, but in a way, if you look at it in the long term, smartphones aren't that old, but nowadays everyone is using it. So likewise, people can understand it, and by knowing that there was a past in which smartphones were not there, then they can actually work towards creating even better gadgets or even better things that may make the future even better. So that's the idea of this point. Basically, history helps us to understand the past, which in turn motivates us to do more for our own future. In a in other words, I guess history helps us to understand ourselves, which will help us to create history. Yeah. So that's the first point. The second point is that history allows us to find out where we came from, which in turn could allow us to see where we are going. So this is like trend analysis. That's what I wanted to say. So it allows us to see the trends. Because when it comes to data, we need a lot of data in order to figure out the actual trend. If you use two data points, then your trend is about as good as mood. You need at least 10 or 20, or I mean, this if it's for a very simple kind of trend, then yeah. But if you want to look at something in which you have no insight how the data will move, then you need lots and lots of points. And the best way to get lots and lots of information is the past. So yeah, we can look at various different kinds of trends, in which I'll give you a few examples. So the first one is, of course, the climate change trends. As I mentioned, how the climate has changed in the past, like the ice age and the temperature increases due to volcanic eruptions and stuff like that. But in this case, I'm not really referring to super, super far back kind of event, but more of how human activity has actually changed the temperature over the years. So if we that's why the usual way that they compare the data is by comparing it to a certain year before the fossil fuels were used, and then they see how the temperature has changed after that. And they also even compare it to what happened before that to just see what's the difference between the impact from natural events and the impact from human activity. And from that, of course, people have concluded that there's definitely something going on with what humans are doing. It's definitely creating a change in the actual average global temperature. So yeah, history helps us to confirm certain things. And apart from climate change, we can then look at space itself, which is once again astronomy. So astronomy, for I mentioned like the asteroids and stuff like that. If you want to prevent the asteroid from hitting us, you need to know whether it is going to hit us or not, right? So by looking at their past positions, we can then predict where they are going to go in the future. So that's what it helps us to do in a way. Of course, you guys might be wondering, okay, you're using history in a very vague sense. I guess you might be right to some extent, but let's just be honest, this is also technically history. It is the study of the past. You're looking at past movements or something or past data to conclude something in the future. And I already mentioned that it can be used in many, many cases, like many situations. So yeah, let's move on. So apart from climate change and astronomy, which I've mentioned way too many times, what else can we talk about? Well, there's stuff like airplane fees and stuff like that. So basically, airplane uh companies use data of demand, like the past data of demand, their past data of how much they charge for every that particular route that they're going on, and how many people bought the tickets in that year, and they used this particular data and then they feed it into this fancy software, and that helps them predict what fees to set for the next year. So the past historical data of demand and movement of people, migration of people, helps airplane companies to figure out what they should do for the coming year. But there's actually a caveat. This year is obviously not the right year for doing that anymore, because as you can see, this year is completely different from basically what last year. Like even last year, you can compare it with this year due to the pandemic. So in that scenario, now airplane companies have to figure out another way to predict what to charge their consumers, or how many seats to even release to the people. And yeah, that's quite interesting to take note of. So apart from airplane fees or how many seats and stuff like that, we can look at weather forecasts, other kinds of forecasts like the crowd forecast. So weather forecast would of course be whether it's going to rain or not in a particular month. The general trend is that it's going to rain. So it's actually just trend. The trend is that it usually rains in November, and it's usually a bit cooler in November and December. Yeah, so that's the general forecast, but somehow this July was unusually a bit cool too. I don't know what happened. Then there's the crowd forecast, which is basically like how if let's say you're going to a location, you can forecast what the crowd will be at 6 p.m. or something. If it's not yet 6 p.m. yet, you can kind of figure it out by because they use the data from the previous week to kind of estimate how many people will be there, or even from the previous year. Let's say if it's a public holiday, then they'll use the data from the previous public holiday, which is 1 year before. So yeah, there's things like that which can be predicted from history and historical trends. And of course, there's also like the stock market and I don't know, all sorts of other things. I think the stock market is more current than these particular things. It's more impacted by very recent history rather than super far back history. Yeah, so apart from such trends, we can also look at policies. So in terms of policy, they can look at what were the past responses to a certain policy. So maybe let's say the country actually uh you know created this they enacted a certain policy this many years ago, and then they removed it, they renounced the policy. So by looking at that event, the government can then decide, okay, should we then try to reenact this policy or is it not worthwhile? So by looking at a historical reaction to a certain policy, it is possible that the government can decide, okay, is it a good idea to do this? And of course, it's not just about the historical context, you must also look at today's context. So you don't just base everything based on history, but also see whether that how it has evolved over time. Yeah. And the last one is evolution of language. So yeah, I did mention Shakespeare, but apart from Shakespeare, I think the most clear example of language evolution is of course the slang. As you can see, there's new words that are becoming slang every day, and yeah, like there are definitely old slang words or old abbreviations that die out, and therefore new generations of people don't get them, or the older people don't get the newer ones. So there's evolution of language right there. And by observing how the language changes over time, we can then predict how it might be in the future. Maybe people will just be talking entirely in emojis and stuff like that. But I think we already seen quite a few of these changes. Like people are using more emojis and even using stickers and stuff like that in your WhatsApp messages. And people aren't really reading as much nowadays, so maybe the way that information is transmitted will be quite different because people generally get their news from their social media feeds rather than going to a news website and reading the full article. Yeah, so we can then use the past data of how it has changed to kind of predict how it will be going in the future and maybe prepare ourselves for it. Yeah, so likewise, you can look at many trends using history, and you know, that's pretty useful for us because let's say if we realize that something is going to happen in the future, or like there's a chance of something that right that could happen in the future, we can then try to prepare ourselves to prevent such a thing from happening or try to mitigate it in some way or the other. Right, so the third and last point here is the deja vu effect of history. So we know how to deal with certain events that have happened before. So basically, I'll be talking about certain events that relate to the politics, pandemics, economic crises, and stuff like that. Okay, so first let me talk about the U.S. president that no one liked. Well, at least finally next year the president is gonna change, and we can feel very happy about it, I guess. And yeah, but actually in 2016 when Trump became the US president, I think the first thing that came to quite a few people's minds was the last time something like this happened. Basically, someone who was working in the entertainment business became a president, and that was when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980 something 81. Yeah, I think so. It was around that time, I think. So it was basically around 10 years before the Cold War ended. Yeah. So basically he was also quite weird, like a bit interesting in his proposed stuff that he wanted to do, like the whole Star Wars kind of system thing that he wanted to do with this rocket to help get rid of any nuclear weapons and stuff. And that's a bit crazy. But somehow the Cold War ended after his presidency, so okay, I guess there was at least one thing that Reagan did better. Anyways, that's not the point. But the point is there's this deja vu, and maybe people can then realize, okay, so what are the possible things that could happen under someone like this, or like what are the possible policy changes that we can see because of a certain person becoming president. So in order to know that, we can then look at similar events that happened in the past, and it's kind of like trend analysis too. It's like like the same trend of policies, but this is more like single events that can be replicated again and again. So we know that history repeats all the time. And yeah, the second one is of course very relevant to 2020. What happened 100 years ago, or slightly more than 100 years ago? in 1918. We all know what happened in 1918. So in 1918, there was the Spanish flu, and that was a pandemic too. Well, it actually rhymed. Okay, anyway, so in 1918, there were actually people who figured out that wearing masks and social distancing was a good thing. And we figured that out 100 years ago. But why today there's still some people who don't know what's going on? Oh man. I mean, there's still people in US who are trying to protest so that they can not wear their mask or something. So I have no idea what's going on. But yeah, we can learn from what happened in 1918 and apply it to today in order to make sure that we do better this time. And of course, we are technically doing a bit better this time because the healthcare system has definitely improved in the last 100 years. But there's still some fundamental things that aren't exactly doing better. Anyways, the next example is something a bit more interesting, which somehow just came to my mind. In the I think it was in 1920, around there, the US had this thing called prohibition, in which they banned alcohol. And honestly, I would be so happy at such a ban because yeah. But okay, no, I mean, no offense against anyone. I'm just saying. Anyways, so what happened during that time was, well, people basically tried to illegally get alcohol. So instead of drinking normal, proper ethanol, some people got some, illegal stuff, and some of it had methanol in it, which is very dangerous. And because of this, a lot of people died. So in the end, prohibition wasn't such a good thing. It's quite hard to prevent people from doing something that is considered a sin in the country. And after a few years, they removed the prohibition. And yeah, you might be wondering, what are you going to compare this with? Well, I could compare it with the drug bans, I suppose. I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? There are quite a few parallels to it because there are lots of illegal drug trade because there is a ban on it. And I mean, at the same time, I do feel like it's good to actually ban some of them because they can be quite not good. Like they're quite unhealthy for someone, and that's even more so than something like alcohol. So I feel like it is good to ban some of them, but at the same time, it is quite interesting to note that with regards to prohibition and today's bans, there's quite a similar pattern of things that are going on. So illegal people who are illegally moving them across the borders and getting caught in the airport and swallowing a bunch of them just to somehow bring them to another country, which is actually more dangerous than, I don't know what's the alternative, but the point is sometimes things repeat, history repeats. That's basically the only point I wanted to say. I'm not going to comment on whether this is good or bad because it's a problem. Okay, yeah, so as you can see, this is another place in which history can repeat in a sense. So the last point is, of course, economic crises. So let's look at two of them, which is the tulip boom and the Great Depression. So in the tulip boom thing, in the Netherlands, basically the price of tulips, because tulips were quite valued, and basically people started raising the value of tulips, and this created, like, a lot of people wanted them, and then this the price kept increasing and increasing and increasing, and then it reached like this there was this bubble and it just burst, and then after that all the tulips are pretty much worthless. So basically this is how that happened, and likewise you can see the same in quite a few housing crises today. Like the price of houses keeps rising and rising and rising, but because it keeps rising and rising and rising, the demand will eventually start decreasing because if the price is too high, then no one wants to buy it, and that leads to a bursting of the bubble, and the price ends up, it just becomes worthless after that, or at least not very worthwhile anymore. So likewise, if we look at things like the Great Depression, it was very similar as well. It was based on the stock market instead. So people like to buy a lot of land stocks in the sense. I think that's what they are. So they like to put little like a lot of people bought them. So since a lot of people bought them, in the price it's just basically inflation, but at the same time there's not enough you know demand to buy them out again. So like people buy, like they invest too much in the thing, but the thing itself isn't going to give them money. So in the end it causes a trouble, and you can see something similar in even in the Asian financial crisis if you want to be really crazy about it. So yeah, you can tell that there's definitely similarities, and history definitely does repeat itself in many ways. And it's good to know about what happened in the past so that if we notice the same thing happening again, at least you'll be better prepared, or at least you can try to stop it if it's something that can be really bad. Yeah, so that is the deja vu effect of history. Right, so those are the 3 points that I had to give for how history is useful in an overall sense, like in a greater community, society, government kind of sense. But there's one very, very important caveat here, which is like the counterpoint kind of thing here. We should note that history can be misconstrued. Basically, in other words, history is written by the winners, which is a quote. I don't know who said that quote, but there's this thing where people say history is written by the winners. So people who, basically got the good side of things try to make it seem like everything was all nice and good. And that's basically not the complete story, it's only half of the story. So it's very important to look at the different point of views. You must look at the bad sides of the story as well, because that's what helps us to learn from history and not just realize, oh, it's all nice and flowers and wonderful stuff. There's also bad stuff that happens in history, and we need to avoid those things from happening again. So there's some few examples. Actually, if you just look at the Wikipedia page, everything is there. You can look at all of the different examples there. But I think the one that was the most evident in the news a few years ago was the Japanese one, in which there was this claim about Japanese history textbooks not exactly representing the history of certain events, comprehensively enough. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So, for example, things like the Nanking massacre. I think I said that completely wrong in a way wrong pronunciation. But anyways, the yeah, so that particular event was quite devastating to Chinese people, I believe, and also South Koreans. I think it's not that particular event, but another event in which involves the comfort woman. So when Japan like invaded Korea once and basically messed up a bunch of females there, so things like that were basically not fully covered in actual Japanese history books, and or at least not in the schools when they're teaching it. They don't really go into that area a lot, which means that the people in Japan sometimes don't even know that their own country or like people in their country long ago did some bad stuff, and then they end up awkwardly defending themselves. Of course, the people today are not at fault. It is more of their ancestors and things like that. But it's good that they should know that such things happen, because everyone else knows about it, and they need to know about it too. Yeah, so that is quite an interesting example. But I think another example would be, of course, one of the most suppressed regimes of the world, which is North Korea. So if I recall correctly, basically after the Korean War, basic in North Korea, they have this whole propaganda thing where they say that of course I think that's pretty obvious. Like they say, oh, the US is our enemy and stuff like that. And then they also have this whole very interesting like godlike story of their leaders, which sounds very amusing to think about it, but okay, cool. So they basically changed their history completely. The history that they're telling is very different from what exactly happened. So yeah, that is really extreme levels of historical manipulation. Yeah, and yeah, we cannot just leave things alone without mentioning America itself. So I mean, even America has got some level of, you know, hidden history that they don't really tell enough of. Like there are some aspects of their civil war or something like that, and also aspects of the um apartheid part of it. Like I think that part isn't covered in great detail in some of their schools. And another interesting point that happens in America sometimes, or even in other countries, which I'll be talking about right now, is that um you know there's this thing where you can say, okay, is it really important to know about history that we learn in school, like the stuff that we are learning in school itself, or is that not what we need to know specifically? So what I mean is, well, I did write this statement. Sometimes it's better to not know the history of something. Well, I can't really think of an example for that question itself, but it's something that you can consider on your own. But what I will talk about instead is what is important to actually learn in history versus what people actually study in history. So what I mean is, in history you can either study the facts, so what year something happened, who did this, who did that, or like what's the sequence of events and stuff like that. So that's one way of studying history, basically just learning a bunch of facts, numbers, memorize something and then do a multiple choice question or just write down the facts, like the whole story. The other way to study history is to see how history relates to us in the real world, and how each of those events, why did they happen in that particular sequence, or how the like how does the particular sequence of events influence yet another different event, or like what consequence those events have. So another way to learn about history is basically learning about the relationship between various events and also the consequences of each of those events. So which part of history is important to learn about? I think this question is quite easy to answer. Yeah, so obviously it's the latter. There's no point just knowing the facts of history when you don't know why you're learning that particular fact in history. So apparently in the US, and also I think in other countries, I think even in India, right, if the way that I hear that history is being taught is more of just you learn the facts, then you regurgitate it. But then again, in India, a lot of things are like that also. You just learn things and regurgitate in the exam. Oh well. Anyways, the point is, if that is what your history is, well, there was no real point to it, I guess. Huh. But then again, school needs to somehow simplify things enough to be able to teach them to a bunch of kids and hope that they can actually remember what they heard and say it in the exam. But the kind of history that I really prefer is the kind that is taught in A levels, because it requires more critical thinking and more connection on your own as well. So yeah, if you think about it, learning just the facts is not worthwhile. It's not very useful, and it doesn't help you in any way. In fact, many of the people forget those facts after they leave school. So I won't like judge anyone for not remembering the specific year when something happened, but I would I would prefer that they know about why the event happened and what's the significance of that particular event and things like that, rather than when it happened. Yeah, so of course, as we learn about why the event was important and all that, you will kind of automatically remember some of the other minute details, like who did what, or what was the role of people in each of those events. But usually remembering years and dates isn't that easy compared to the actual important information that you can get from the event. So in other words, this brings us to the final point, which is that critical thinking is required for history. And critical thinking is what we require in order to make history useful in the greater context. And history itself does help you develop your critical thinking skills if you learn it in the right way and not just learn the facts and stuff. And that's why I think A level history is really nice. It actually teaches you a lot of useful things, and you get to appreciate history a lot more if when you're taking it in maybe secondary school and A levels. Yeah. So for this final point, what is the rationale behind saying critical thinking is important? Well, if you don't have critical thinking when it comes to history, then you can't really derive a conclusion or make connections between the information that you get. Like all the information that you get is just not very useful on their own. You need to connect the dots. Think about why you made such connections and see how that relates to the present day context, and that will then help you in the present day context in the sense. So by thinking about it and being critically thinking about it, and also making sure to validate the different points of view as well. It's not just you look at only one point of view and you're like, okay, that nothing bad happened and that's it. But instead you must think about it further, think about, okay, is there another way that we can actually look at this history? And once you figure that out, you can then search how to get that particular information, and then you can actually go further and deeper into it and get more insight into what happened in that period of time. So in a way, history only becomes really useful if you, one, think about what you're seeing in front of you, and two, actively make sure that you get all the points of view possible and all of the different ways to view this particular information. Yeah, so if you do those two things, then history becomes useful. Yeah, that's pretty much about it. I think this episode became too long by accident, and now I have extra work to do because I made it too long. Uh, anyways, I hope you find this, video useful. What you can learn by seeing that this video was done on 4th of December is that I should probably figure out how to make my videos shorter.